Alright, so you guys have seen this graph before. This is similar to the graph of the federal funds market, but instead, since we're talking about bond dynamics, this is going to be the graph of the bond market. And similar to the way that we said supplies is the savers and demand is the buyers or the borrowers for banks, instead in the bond market, or similarly, supply is going to be the borrowers. What this means is the supply is the people issuing the bonds. So if you issue a bond, you're borrowing money, being the price of the bond, and paying periodic payments, being the coupon rate and coupon payments, in order to pay off that bond. Alright, so these are the sellers. So demand's the buyers. Or savers too. So looking at a graph like this, we can go over a few different examples of market shifters. A really easy one to think about would be, say, the buyers expect the stock market in the United States to do very well in the future. Well, what this means for the bond market is that demand is going to decrease. Okay. And from that decrease in demand, you can see, and I forgot to draw this out, but it's pretty obvious to see that there would be a decrease in the price of bonds. Remember, price and interest rates have an inverse relationship, so this means that interest rates for bonds would increase. Now let's go through a more prominent example, one that could be much more applicable to macroeconomics and economic environment. Let's say everybody expects an increase in interest rates, everybody being both borrowers and buyers. So what does this mean for the supply side first, the borrowers or the sellers of bonds? Well, this would actually increase supply in the bond market. And the reason for this is because if borrowers or sellers of bonds know that in the future interest rates are going to be higher, meaning the cost of borrowing money is going to be higher in the future, today they are going to issue more bonds to take advantage of the interest rates they know today are going to be lower than the ones in the future that are going to be higher. Similarly, for demand, nobody is going to pay for bonds that they know are going to be worth less in the future. Right? Remember interest rates and price inverse relationship. Why would I buy a bond today that I know in the future is going to decrease in value? That's why demand decreases. And what happens here is we can see this obvious decrease in price, like the last example. Now let's go through another good example, being inflation, one we just talked about. This time, everybody expects inflation to be lower in the future. How will this affect the supply side? Supply would decrease. Why would supply decrease? Well, when inflation is going to decrease in the future, we know that the real cost of borrowing is going to increase in the future. That's just what happens when inflation changes. So a seller is not going to want to lock in these payments when they know that the real cost of borrowing this money is going to be higher in the future. Now demand would increase as well because, or sorry, not as well, but demand would increase because they want to lock in these real higher payments today. You can kind of see the relationship between supply and demand here. They move in different directions in terms of these things. So if inflation is lower and supply decreases for sellers, demand is probably going to increase for buyers because they want to take advantage where borrowers don't. Same thing for interest rates. If borrowers don't want to lock in the rates that they know are going to be higher in the future, buyers will. If buyers don't, borrowers will. And from this example, we can see that price increases, which will lead to a decrease in interest rates as well. Okay, so the last example we're going to go through, and a very popular one that happens all the time, is what happens when the government increases their borrowing, meaning they supply more bonds. And I'm sure you can guess this, but supply would increase. And this is probably like a no-duh scenario for a bunch of you guys. But something I want to talk about that isn't seen in this graph that is important to think about when the government issues more bonds through auctions or other forms of issuance of bonds is what happens to other bonds. in the market, specifically corporate bonds. What happens when the government does this is they kind of undercut the prices of corporate bonds, also known as indirect crowding out. They really take away from the profits that companies could be getting from these corporate bonds because their prices for their bonds are so much cheaper. Now, these sorts of scenarios, it's not something you see in a graph. It's something you kind of have to think about and know about through research or other sort of tools. This just kind of goes to say that these graphs can help in gauging what you think would happen through interest rates, inflation, or the obvious factors like government issuing more bonds. But there's other things that you need to think about through research or other tools. There are a lot of different factors that affect bond dynamics and the bond market as a whole. We went through a few key ones that you're going to see a lot, like interest rates and inflation. But even subtle things like a stock market in Germany is doing really good, this can have an effect on the US bond market easily. It may be very subtle, but it still affects it. So there's lots of different ways that shifters can happen in the bond market, and there's lots of different ways to analyze it. So just keep this in mind when you're doing research.